Picture this. You're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner, and your uncle asks what you do for work. You mention YouTube, and suddenly the entire table goes quiet. Then comes the laughter, the eye rolls, the comments about getting a real job. Fast forward 18 months, and that same family is asking for financial advice while you're depositing checks that have more zeros than their annual salaries. This is exactly what happened to me. And trust me, but journey from embarrassment to $800,000 a month was nothing like I expected. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. It started on a Tuesday morning in March 2022. I was 24 years old, living in my childhood bedroom in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, working at a marketing firm called Brightside Digital for $38,000 a year. The job was soul-crushing. I spent my days creating social media posts for plumbing companies and dental offices, watching the clock tick by agonizing minute. My name is Jessica Martinez, and back then, I felt like I was drowning in mediocrity. Every morning, I'd wake up to my alarm at 6:30, shower, grab coffee, and drive 25 minutes to an office where I'd pretend to be passionate about increasing engagement rates for businesses I didn't care about. My boss, Mr. Henderson, was one of those managers who believed that staying late meant working hard, even when there was nothing productive to accomplish. But during my lunch breaks, I had a secret. I'd sit in my Honda Civic in the parking lot, eating my turkey sandwich, and watch YouTube videos about true crime cases. Not the polished, high-production documentaries everyone knew about, but the smaller channels that dove deep into cases that barely made local news. I became obsessed with a channel called Forgotten Files that had maybe 15,000 subscribers, but told stories that kept me up at night. One afternoon, while researching a case about a missing person from 1987 for my own curiosity, I discovered something that made my heart race. The YouTuber had gotten a crucial detail wrong about the timeline. I knew this because I'd spent 3 hours the night before reading police reports and newspaper archives. The error wasn't just a small mistake, it completely changed the theory about what might have happened. I typed out a comment explaining the correction, including links to my sources. Within an hour, my comment had 50 likes and replies from other viewers thanking me for the clarification. The channel owner even responded, saying they'd pin my comment and create a follow-up video addressing the correction. Something clicked at that moment. I realized I wasn't just consuming content anymore. I had something to contribute. That weekend, I borrowed my dad's old camcorder from 2015 and set it up in my bedroom. The lighting was terrible, casting harsh shadows across my face, and my voice shook as I spoke into the camera. I chose to talk about the case of Maria Gonzalez, a 19-year-old college student who disappeared from a gas station in Tucson in 1994. The case had always bothered me because the investigation seemed to stop after just 6 weeks, despite having several promising leads. I spent 12 hours editing that first video on my laptop, learning how to cut clips and add text overlays through YouTube tutorials. The final product was rough around the edges, but it told Maria's story in a way I hadn't seen anywhere else. I focused on the small details that other content creators missed. The fact that her car keys were found in a storm drain 3 blocks away from the gas station. The witness who saw a blue pickup truck speeding away around the time she disappeared, and the phone call she made to her roommate just 20 minutes before vanishing. When I finally uploaded the video at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, my hands were trembling as I typed the title, "The Maria Gonzalez Case: Why Police Gave Up Too Soon." I set the thumbnail to a simple photo of Maria from her college yearbook and hit publish before I could change my mind. I refreshed the page obsessively for the next hour. 1 view, 3 views, then nothing for what felt like forever. I went to bed convinced I'd made a fool of myself. I woke up to 17 views and 2 comments. One was from someone who knew Maria's family and thanked me for keeping her memory alive. The other was from a retired detective who said my analysis of the evidence was more thorough than what he'd seen in the original case files. Those 2 comments meant more to me than any performance review I'd ever received at work.
Over the next month, I uploaded 3 more videos. Each one took me an entire weekend to research and produce. I covered the disappearance of David Kim, a software engineer who vanished during a hiking trip in Colorado. Then I investigated the unsolved murder of Patricia Williams, a teacher whose case went cold after the main suspect died in a car accident. My 4th video explored the strange circumstances surrounding the death of Robert Chen, a businessman whose body was found in his locked office under impossible conditions. My subscriber count crept up slowly. 23 subscribers after the first video, 41 after the second, 67 after the third. By the 4th video, I had 92 people who cared enough about my content to click that subscribe button. The comments section became a community where viewers shared their own research, debated theories, and suggested cases for me to investigate. But my family saw things differently. It started with innocent questions. My mom, Linda, noticed I was staying up late on weekends and asked what I was working on. When I explained about the YouTube channel, she smiled politely and said it sounded like a nice hobby. My dad, Carlos, was more direct. He looked at my subscriber count and asked when I planned to monetize this thing because otherwise it seemed like a waste of time.
My older brother, Miguel, was the worst. He worked as an account manager at a software company and made $65,000 a year, which he never let me forget. When I showed him my 4th video, which had gotten over 1,000 views, he laughed and said, "Jess, you do realize that talking to a camera about dead people isn't a real career, right? You're 24. When are you going to get serious about your life?" The criticism stung, but not as much as the conversation I overheard between my parents a few weeks later. I'd come home from work early because I was feeling sick, and I heard them talking in the kitchen. My mom was saying she was worried about me living in fantasy land, and that my little video project was preventing me from focusing on advancing my career. My dad agreed, adding that he was concerned I was becoming antisocial because I spent so much time alone researching instead of going out with friends. That conversation haunted me for days. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was wasting my time chasing something that would never amount to anything. I had 92 subscribers after a month of work. Even if I somehow grew to 1,000 subscribers, that wouldn't pay my bills or move me out of my childhood bedroom. But then something happened that changed everything. I received a message from someone named Detective Patricia Morrison. She was a retired homicide investigator from the Tucson Police Department who had worked on the Maria Gonzalez case in the 1990s. She said she'd watched my video and was impressed by the research I'd done. More importantly, she had information that wasn't in the public case files, information that might help solve Maria's disappearance after nearly 30 years. We talked on the phone for 2 hours. Detective Morrison told me about evidence that had never been properly followed up on, witnesses who were never interviewed, and leads that were abandoned when the department shifted resources to higher profile cases. She offered to meet with me in person and share documents from her personal files, copies she'd kept because she never felt right about how the case was handled. I drove to Tucson the next weekend with my dad's camcorder and a notebook full of questions. Detective Morrison met me at a coffee shop near her house, and we spent 4 hours going through evidence photos, witness statements, and investigation notes that revealed just how poorly the case had been handled. She even agreed to be interviewed on camera, though she asked me to blur her face and alter her voice for privacy reasons. The resulting video was 37 minutes long, by far my longest yet. I titled it, "Breaking: New Evidence in Maria Gonzalez Case After 28 Years, and uploaded it on a Thursday evening in May. This time, I didn't have to refresh the page obsessively to see views trickling in. The numbers climbed steadily from the moment it went live. 100 views in the first hour, 500 by the end of the night, 2,000 by the next morning. The comment section exploded with viewers sharing the video, tagging true crime communities, and praising the exclusive nature of the content. Other YouTubers in the true crime space began commenting, saying they'd never seen such detailed investigation work from a channel with fewer than 100 subscribers. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. But the real breakthrough came 3 days after the video was published. I received a message from someone claiming to be Maria's younger sister, Carmen. She said she'd been searching for answers about her sister's disappearance for decades, and that my video contained information she'd never heard before, even from the police. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak with her mother, who had kept all of Maria's belongings and had her own theories about what happened. Of course, I said yes. That phone call with Maria's mother, Rosa Gonzalez, lasted 3 hours. She cried as she told me about the police refusing to take the case seriously because Maria was Latina and came from a working-class family. She shared details about Maria's life that painted a completely different picture than the one in the police reports. Most importantly, she gave me permission to tell Maria's full story and to use family photos and personal items in my investigation. The follow-up video, Maria Gonzalez, Her Family Speaks for the First Time, became my first viral success. It reached 10,000 views in the first 24 hours and kept climbing. My subscriber count jumped from 92 to over 800 in a single week. The comments weren't just from random viewers anymore. They were from Maria's friends, former classmates, and people who remembered her from college. Then came the message that would change everything. A private investigator named James Sullivan reached out, saying he'd been following my coverage of the Maria Gonzalez case and was impressed by the quality of my research. He represented a family in California whose daughter had disappeared under similar circumstances in 1996. The police investigation had stalled, and the family was desperate for someone to take a fresh look at the case. They were willing to pay me $5,000 to create a comprehensive video series about their daughter's disappearance, with full access to all case materials and family cooperation. $5,000. That was more than I made in 2 months at Brightside Digital. I stared at the message for 20 minutes, reading it over and over. Someone was willing to pay me actual money to do exactly what I'd been doing for free. Not only that, but they specifically sought me out because of the work I'd already done. This wasn't charity or pity, it was recognition that I had a valuable skill. But when I told my family about the opportunity, their reactions were exactly what I expected. Miguel rolled his eyes and said, "$5,000? Jess, that's not a career. That's a one-time thing. What happens when you finish that project? You can't build a life on random payments from desperate families." My mom was more supportive, but equally skeptical. "It's wonderful that people appreciate your work, honey, but you need to be realistic. You can't quit your real job based on one freelance project." My dad was somewhere in the middle. $5,000 is good money, but Miguel has a point. What's your long-term plan here? You can't just hope more families will hire you. They weren't wrong to be concerned. I had no business plan, no clear path forward, and no guarantee that this would lead to sustainable income. But I also knew that I'd never felt more passionate about anything in my life. When I was researching cases, interviewing family members, and piecing together evidence, hours passed like minutes. When I was at my marketing job, minutes felt like hours. I decided to take the California case. The family lived in Sacramento, and their daughter, Emma Richardson, had disappeared from a shopping mall parking lot in 1996 when she was 22 years old. Unlike Maria's case, this investigation had been thorough initially, but it hit a dead end when all the physical evidence failed to lead to a suspect. The family had spent 26 years wondering what happened to Emma, and they'd seen my Maria Gonzalez videos as proof that I could uncover angles that professional investigators had missed. I used 2 weeks of vacation time from my job to travel to Sacramento and immerse myself completely in Emma's case. I interviewed her parents, her best friend from college, her coworkers from the retail job she'd held at the time, and even tracked down her ex-boyfriend, who had been cleared as a suspect early in the investigation. What I discovered was that Emma had been receiving strange phone calls in the weeks before her disappearance. Her roommate remembered her mentioning them, but didn't think much of it at the time. The police had never followed up on these calls because Emma's phone records from 1996 had been destroyed years earlier as part of routine record keeping. But I found something the police had missed. Emma's mother had kept a detailed calendar where she wrote down everything important that happened in her children's lives. In the weeks before Emma disappeared, there were several entries about Emma being upset about those calls again and thinks someone is watching her at work.
This led me to track down Emma's former coworkers, several of whom remembered a man who would come into the store where Emma worked and specifically ask for her help, even when other employees were available. He was described as middle-aged, well-dressed, and polite, but Emma had mentioned to her coworkers that he made her uncomfortable because he seemed to know details about her schedule and her life that she hadn't shared with him.
The three-part series I created about Emma's case was my first professionally produced content. I'd invested some of the $5,000 in better camera equipment and editing software. The videos looked and sounded completely different from my early work. More importantly, the exclusive access to family members and previously unexplored evidence made the series feel like a real documentary rather than just someone talking to a camera. The first video in the Emma Richardson series got 50,000 views in its first week. The second video hit 75,000. The third video, which revealed the connection between the mysterious caller and the man who had been watching Emma at work, reached 120,000 views and was shared across multiple true crime forums and social media groups. My subscriber count exploded to over 5,000, and my inbox filled with messages from other families asking if I'd investigate their cases. Some offered payment, others just begged for someone to care about their missing loved ones. I realized I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a hobby or even a side business. I'd found a way to help people while doing work that I was genuinely passionate about. But my family still saw it as a phase I needed to outgrow. The real tension with my family started during my cousin Rebecca's wedding in August 2022. I'd been running my channel for 5 months by then, and I was sitting at the singles table with my cousins and family friends. Everyone was going around sharing what they did for work, and when it got to me, I mentioned that I was transitioning from marketing into investigative journalism on YouTube. My Aunt Sarah laughed so loud that people at nearby tables turned to look. Investigative journalism? Jessica, you make videos in your bedroom about murders that happened before you were born. That's not journalism, honey. My Uncle Pete, who worked in construction, chimed in. At least tell me you're making good money doing this video thing. When I explained that I'd made about $8,000 in the past 3 months, he shook his head. $8,000 in 3 months? Jess, my apprentice makes more than that, and he's 19 years old. But the conversation that really hurt happened later that evening. I was helping my mom collect centerpieces when I overheard her talking to my Aunt Linda near the gift table. Aunt Linda was asking about my phase, and my mom sighed before saying, I just don't understand what happened to her ambition. She had such a good job at that marketing company, and now she's obsessed with these depressing stories. Carlos and I are worried she's losing touch with reality. That night, lying in the hotel bed, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I was going to prove them wrong, not through arguments or explanations, but through results they couldn't dismiss. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. A documentary filmmaker named Amanda Chen reached out after seeing my Emma Richardson series. She was working on a Netflix project about unsolved disappearances in the American Southwest and wanted to license clips from my videos for their production. More importantly, she offered me a consulting role on the project, helping them research cases and verify information. The consulting fee was $15,000 for 6 weeks of work, and my name would appear in the credits as a research consultant. It was legitimate, professional recognition of my skills, and it came with a connection to the entertainment industry that could open doors I'd never imagined. But there was a catch. The 6 weeks of intensive work would require me to take a leave of absence from Brightside Digital, and there was no guarantee of similar projects afterward. It was a risk, but it felt like the kind of opportunity that only comes once. I submitted my leave request on a Monday morning, explaining to Mr. Henderson that I had a consulting opportunity with a major streaming platform. His reaction was everything I expected and worse. He told me that taking unpaid leave for hobby projects showed a lack of commitment to my career development. He strongly suggested I reconsider, implying that my position might not be available when I returned. The conversation with my parents that evening was even more difficult. When I explained about the Netflix consulting work, my dad's first question was whether it would lead to a permanent position. When I said it was project-based, he threw his hands up in frustration. Jessica, you're gambling with your future, he said. You have a steady job with benefits and room for advancement, and you want to throw it away for 6 weeks of temporary work?
what happens after those 6 weeks? You'll be unemployed with nothing to show for it. My mom was gentler but equally concerned. Honey, I know this feels exciting, but you need to think practically. Netflix isn't going to hire you full-time based on one project. You're risking a real career for something that might not exist 6 months from now. Miguel was the most blunt. Jess, this is exactly the kind of decision that keeps people stuck living with their parents at 25. You're choosing fantasy over reality, and it's going to bite you in the ass. They weren't entirely wrong. I was taking a significant risk, and there were no guarantees. But I also knew that staying at Brightside Digital meant accepting that my current life was as good as it would ever get. The Netflix project represented a chance to prove that my skills were valuable enough for major entertainment companies to pay for them. I took the leave of absence.
The Netflix project was unlike anything I'd experienced. Amanda Chen introduced me to a team of researchers, fact-checkers, and investigative journalists who worked at a level I'd only dreamed about. They had access to databases, law enforcement contacts, and research tools that made my previous work look amateur by comparison. My job was to verify the information in cases they were considering for the documentary and to identify any angles or evidence that might have been overlooked. It was exactly the kind of work I'd been doing on my channel, but with professional resources and a team of experts to collaborate with. The first case they assigned me was the disappearance of Marcus Thompson, a college student who vanished from a camping trip in Arizona in 2001. The police investigation had concluded that he'd likely fallen into a ravine during a solo hike, but his family insisted something more sinister had happened. Using Netflix's research resources, I was able to access cell phone records, credit card statements, and witness interviews that had never been made public. What I found completely changed the narrative. Marcus hadn't gone on a solo hike the day he disappeared. He'd driven to a remote area to meet someone he'd been in contact with through early internet chat rooms. The person he was meeting had used multiple fake identities and had been in contact with at least 3 other young men who had also disappeared in the Southwest during the early 2000s. Amanda was impressed enough with my findings to restructure their entire episode around this new angle. She told the other researchers that I'd uncovered more in 2 weeks than their previous consultant had found in 2 months. More importantly, she began introducing me to other filmmakers and producers who were working on similar projects. By the end of the 6 weeks, I had 3 more consulting offers lined up, totaling another $40,000 in potential income. The work was challenging, professionally fulfilling, and paid better than anything I'd ever done. I also had something I'd never had before: industry credibility. When I returned to Brightside Digital to give my official resignation, Mr. Henderson's attitude had completely shifted. Suddenly, he was interested in hearing about my Netflix work and asking if I'd consider staying on part-time to help with their content strategy. The same boss who had questioned my commitment 6 weeks earlier was now trying to figure out how to keep me. I gave 2 weeks' notice and walked out of that office for the last time, feeling lighter than I had in years. But my family's reaction to my career change was mixed at best. When I explained that I'd lined up enough consulting work to earn more in the next 6 months than I'd made in the previous year at the marketing firm, my parents were cautiously optimistic. The Netflix credit and the professional connections impressed them more than my YouTube subscriber count ever had. Miguel, however, remained skeptical. "Consulting work is still temporary, Jess. You're basically a freelancer now, which means no benefits, no job security, and no predictable income. What happens when this documentary trend ends and nobody wants true crime content anymore?" His concerns weren't unreasonable. Freelance work was inherently less stable than traditional employment, and the entertainment industry was notoriously unpredictable. But I'd learned something important during my 6 weeks with the Netflix team. My research skills weren't just useful for YouTube videos. They were valuable to filmmakers, podcasters, journalists, and even law enforcement agencies who needed someone who could dig deeper into cold cases than their regular staff had time for. I decided to treat my career change like a business rather than just following my passion. I created a website advertising my services as a cold case researcher and consultant. I developed rate sheets for different types of projects: basic case research, family consultations, media consultation, and comprehensive investigation packages. I even registered my business officially.
Martinez Investigations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Families who had seen my YouTube videos reached out wanting to hire me to investigate their cases. Podcast producers needed researchers who specialized in lesser-known disappearances. True crime authors wanted fact-checkers who could verify their information and suggest new angles. Within 3 months of leaving Brightside Digital, I was booked solid for the next 6 months and had a waiting list of potential clients. My YouTube channel had grown to 15,000 subscribers, and the videos I created as part of my client work often went viral within the true crime community. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Detective Patricia Morrison, the retired investigator who had helped me with the Maria Gonzalez case, called to tell me that the Tucson Police Department was reopening Maria's investigation based on the evidence I'd uncovered. They were treating it as an active case for the first time in 28 years, and they wanted to interview me formally as part of their renewed investigation. When I told my family about the police reopening Maria's case, something shifted in how they viewed my work. This wasn't just entertainment or even journalism anymore. I had actually helped restart an official investigation that might finally bring answers to a family that had been waiting for decades. My mom cried when I showed her the news article about the case being reopened. She said she was proud of me for never giving up on Maria's story and that she was sorry for not understanding how important my work was. My dad admitted that he'd been wrong to discourage me from leaving my marketing job, and even Miguel acknowledged that I'd built something real and meaningful. The financial success was growing too, but it wasn't the dramatic windfall that would come later. By the end of 2022, I was averaging about $12,000 a month between consulting fees, YouTube ad revenue, and sponsored content. It was good money, enough to move out of my childhood bedroom and rent a small house in Phoenix, but it wasn't the kind of income that would shock my family into complete silence.
That transformation was still months away, and it would come from a direction none of us saw coming. January 2023 brought a message that would change everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. A woman named Victoria Blackwood contacted me through my business website, claiming to represent a high-net-worth individual who preferred to remain anonymous. She said her client had been following my work and wanted to discuss a potential long-term arrangement that would be mutually beneficial. The whole thing sounded sketchy. In my experience, legitimate clients introduced themselves directly and explained their cases up front. People who insisted on anonymity and used vague phrases like mutually beneficial were usually trying to scam someone or involved in something questionable. But Victoria was persistent and professional. She provided references from other investigators she'd worked with, sent me a detailed non-disclosure agreement that had clearly been prepared by expensive lawyers, and offered to meet at a high-end law office in downtown Phoenix to discuss the opportunity in person. Against my better judgment, I agreed to the meeting. Victoria Blackwood was nothing like what I expected. She was probably in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in a way that screamed money, and spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from representing people who are used to getting what they want. The law office where we met was the kind of place with marble floors and original oil paintings, definitely not where I usually conducted business. She explained that her client was a technology entrepreneur who had become fascinated with unsolved cases after a family member's disappearance had never been resolved. Rather than hiring traditional private investigators who were expensive and often ineffective with cold cases, he wanted to fund a different approach. The proposal was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Her client wanted to provide me with unlimited research resources, professional-grade equipment, and access to databases and contacts that weren't available to the general public. In exchange, I would investigate cases that he selected, with the understanding that some of these cases might involve wealthy or prominent individuals who preferred discretion. The monthly retainer they were offering was $45,000, plus expenses and bonuses for successfully closed cases. It was more money than I'd ever imagined making, but something about the arrangement felt too good to be true. I asked the obvious question, why me? Victoria's answer was straightforward. My client work had demonstrated that I could uncover information that professional investigators missed, and my YouTube presence meant I could generate public interest in cases when needed.
More importantly, I wasn't connected to law enforcement or traditional investigative firms, which meant I could operate with more flexibility. The cases they wanted me to investigate weren't random cold cases. They were specifically chosen disappearances and unexplained deaths that had connections to powerful people or suspicious circumstances that had never been properly explored. My job would be to dig into these cases with the same thoroughness I'd applied to Maria Gonzalez and Emma Richardson, but with vastly superior resources. The monthly retainer they were offering was $45,000, plus expenses and bonuses for successfully closed cases. It was more money than I'd ever imagined making, but something about the arrangement felt too good to be true. I asked the obvious question, why me? Victoria's answer was straightforward. My client work had demonstrated that I could uncover information that professional investigators missed, and my YouTube presence meant I could generate public interest in cases when needed. More importantly, I wasn't connected to law enforcement or traditional investigative firms, which meant I could operate with more flexibility. The cases they wanted me to investigate weren't random cold cases. They were specifically chosen disappearances and unexplained deaths that had connections to powerful people or suspicious circumstances that had never been properly explored. My job would be to dig into these cases with the same thoroughness I'd applied to Maria Gonzalez and Emma Richardson, but with vastly superior resources. I told Victoria I needed time to think about it. The money was tempting, but something felt off about the whole arrangement. Why would someone spend over $500,000 a year to investigate cold cases? What was the real motivation behind this offer? That night, I called Detective Morrison to get her opinion. She listened to my description of the meeting and was quiet for a long moment before responding. Jessica, that sounds like someone who has their own reasons for wanting these cases solved. It could be legitimate, but you need to be very careful about what you're getting involved in. She suggested I do some research on Victoria Blackwood before making any decisions. What I found was both reassuring and concerning. Victoria was a legitimate consultant who worked for several high-profile clients, including celebrities and tech executives. She specialized in what the industry called reputation management and crisis resolution. In other words, she helped rich people solve problems quietly. But she was also connected to some genuinely philanthropic efforts. She'd helped fund the Innocence Project, supported families of missing persons, and had even testified before Congress about the need for better resources for cold case investigations. It wasn't immediately clear whether her clients' motivations were altruistic or self-serving. After a week of research and consideration, I decided to accept the offer, but with conditions. I would maintain editorial control over any cases I investigated, I could decline to work on cases that made me uncomfortable, and I retained the right to terminate the arrangement at any time. The first case they assigned me was the 2018 disappearance of Dr. Rachel Kim, a biotech researcher who had vanished from her apartment in San Diego without any explanation. The police investigation had been thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. No signs of struggle, no financial irregularities, no obvious motive for someone to harm her. What made the case interesting was that Dr. Kim had been working on cutting-edge research related to genetic therapies, and she'd recently expressed concerns to colleagues about the ethical implications of her work. She'd also been in contact with a journalist who was investigating questionable practices in the biotech industry. With my new resources, I was able to access cell phone records, financial data, and communications that had been beyond my reach in previous cases. What I discovered was that Dr. Kim hadn't just disappeared randomly. In the weeks before she vanished, she'd been systematically transferring her research data to encrypted drives and had opened several offshore bank accounts.
More importantly, she'd been in contact with a whistleblower protection organization and had scheduled a meeting with federal investigators for the week after she disappeared. Dr. Kim hadn't been abducted or killed. She'd gone into hiding because she'd discovered something in her research that she felt compelled to expose, even if it meant giving up her entire life. The investigation took 3 months and led me across 4 states, interviewing former colleagues, federal agents, and even Dr. Kim's estranged sister, who hadn't spoken to her in 5 years. The final piece of the puzzle came from an encrypted email account that Dr. Kim had set up to communicate with the journalist. She was alive, living under a new identity in Canada, and still working with federal investigators to expose the illegal practices she'd discovered in her research. Her disappearance had been carefully planned to protect her from retaliation while she prepared to testify in a case that would eventually result in multiple arrests and hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. When I presented my findings to Victoria, her client was so impressed that he immediately authorized a $50,000 bonus on top of my monthly retainer. But more importantly, he wanted me to take on additional cases, each one more complex and well-funded than the last. By June 2023, I was handling 4 major investigations simultaneously, each with unlimited expense budgets and access to resources I'd never dreamed of having. I hired 2 research assistants, rented professional office space, and invested in equipment that made my previous setup look like amateur hour. My YouTube channel exploded during this period. The cases I was working on were inherently more dramatic and mysterious than the local disappearances I'd covered before. When I could share details publicly, the videos regularly hit hundreds of thousands of views within days of being uploaded. The Dr. Rachel Kim case alone generated over 2 million views across 3 videos, and my subscriber count jumped to over 200,000. Suddenly, other YouTubers were reaching out for collaborations, true crime podcasters wanted me as a guest, and I was getting interview requests from legitimate news outlets. But the most significant change wasn't the money or the fame. It was the realization that I'd somehow become a real investigative journalist without ever intending to. The cases I was solving were making national news. Families were getting answers they'd waited years for. Federal investigations were being launched based on evidence I'd uncovered. When Rolling Stone magazine featured me in an article about the new generation of digital detectives, my parents finally seemed to understand that this wasn't a phase or a hobby anymore. I was doing work that mattered on a scale they'd never imagined possible. My mom called me the day the article was published, crying as she apologized for not supporting my decision to leave marketing. She said she and my dad were proud of what I'd accomplished and sorry they'd made me feel like I had to choose between family approval and following my passion. Even Miguel, who had been my harshest critic, admitted he'd been wrong. He said he'd been watching my videos and was amazed by the depth of my investigations. More importantly, he'd started telling his coworkers that his sister was a famous investigative journalist, a far cry from his earlier embarrassment about my weird hobby. By the end of 2023, my anonymous client had expanded our arrangement even further. Instead of just investigating individual cases, he wanted me to launch a comprehensive cold case initiative that would tackle dozens of unsolved disappearances and unexplained deaths across the country. The new contract was worth $120,000 a month, plus unlimited expenses and performance bonuses. I would have a team of 6 full-time researchers, partnerships with law enforcement agencies in 12 states, and access to forensic resources that were typically reserved for federal investigations. I was making more money in a month than my previous job at the marketing firm paid in 3 years, but I still hadn't told my family the exact numbers. They knew I was successful, but I'd been deliberately vague about just how successful. The truth was, I wasn't sure they'd believe me if I told them I was averaging close to $200,000 a month, including bonuses and YouTube revenue. That conversation was still coming, and it would happen sooner than I expected. February 2024 brought the case that would change everything, though it started with what seemed like a routine assignment. Victoria contacted me about investigating the 2019 disappearance of Thomas Wellington III, the heir to a pharmaceutical fortune who had vanished during a business trip to Seattle. The official story was that he'd suffered from depression and likely committed suicide, despite no body ever being found. What made this case different wasn't the disappearance itself, but what I discovered about Thomas's activities in the months before he vanished. He'd been quietly selling off his company shares, liquidating investments, and moving money into cryptocurrency accounts that couldn't be easily traced. More intriguingly, he'd been in contact with investigative journalists who were looking into his family's company's involvement in the opioid crisis. The deeper I dug, the more it became clear that Thomas hadn't disappeared because of depression. He'd uncovered evidence that his own pharmaceutical company had been deliberately manipulating addiction studies and bribing doctors to overprescribe their medications. Thomas was planning to become a whistleblower against his own billion-dollar inheritance. But here's where things got complicated. As I pieced together Thomas's final weeks, I realized that my anonymous client wasn't just some tech entrepreneur with a passion for justice. The cases he'd been assigning me weren't random cold cases. They were all connected to corporate scandals, government cover-ups, and powerful people who had reasons to make problems disappear. Thomas Wellington's case was personal for my client because Thomas had been scheduled to meet with him the week he vanished. My client wasn't just funding my investigations out of philanthropic interest, he was using my research to build cases against the same corrupt networks that had silenced Thomas and countless others. When I confronted Victoria about this revelation, she didn't deny it. Instead, she offered me something that took my breath away, a partnership in what my client was calling the Accountability Project. Instead of just investigating individual cases, I would become the public face of a comprehensive effort to expose systemic corruption, using the same investigative techniques I developed for cold cases. The financial terms were staggering. A base salary of $300,000 per year, plus revenue sharing from a multimedia platform that would include my YouTube channel, a podcast network, a streaming documentary series, and partnerships with major news outlets. Conservative projections suggested I could earn between $600,000 and $800,000 monthly once the platform was fully operational. I spent 2 weeks trying to wrap my head around the numbers. $800,000 a month was more money than most people made in a decade. It was enough to buy a house with cash every month. It was generational wealth being offered to someone who had been living in her parents' house just 2 years earlier. But the money wasn't even the most mind-blowing part. The Accountability Project would give me resources that investigative journalists at major newspapers could only dream of. Unlimited travel budgets, forensic specialists, data analysts, legal teams, and access to information networks that spanned multiple continents. More importantly, it would allow me to tackle the kind of cases that could actually change things on a massive scale. Instead of just giving individual families closure about their missing loved ones, I could expose the systems that allowed powerful people to make problems disappear in the first place. The first major investigation under the new arrangement was a series exploring how wealthy individuals and corporations use private security firms to intimidate whistleblowers and journalists. It was exactly the kind of story that traditional media outlets struggled to pursue because of the legal and financial risks involved. But with unlimited legal protection and research resources, I was able to document a network of companies that specialized in making inconvenient people disappear, not through violence, but through systematic harassment, financial pressure, and social isolation. The series revealed how dozens of potential whistleblowers had been silenced through coordinated campaigns designed to destroy their credibility and livelihoods. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks of the first video being published, federal investigators launched inquiries into 3 different security firms. 2 major pharmaceutical companies fired their CEOs after evidence emerged of their involvement in these schemes. Most importantly, other whistleblowers began coming forward, protected by the attention my investigation had generated. My YouTube channel exploded to over 1 million subscribers practically overnight. The videos in this series were getting 5 to 10 million views each, and major news networks were licensing my footage for their own reports. I was being interviewed on CNN, invited to testify before congressional committees, and receiving interview requests from journalists around the world. But even with all this success and recognition, I still hadn't told my family about the true scale of my financial situation. They knew I was doing well. I'd bought a beautiful house in Scottsdale, I drove a new car, and I'd paid off their mortgage as a Christmas surprise, but I'd been vague about the specific numbers. The conversation I'd been avoiding finally happened in April 2024 at my nephew's birthday party. Miguel's wife, Sarah, was talking about how expensive their mortgage had become, and my mom mentioned that they didn't need to worry about it anymore because I'd taken care of it. Sarah looked confused and asked how I could afford to pay off a $300,000 mortgage if I was just starting my career. My mom explained that I was doing very well with my YouTube channel and consulting work, but Sarah pressed for details. I mean, Jessica's videos are popular, but YouTubers don't make that kind of money unless they have like 10 million subscribers, right? How much are you actually making from this? The entire family turned to look at me, and I realized I couldn't dodge the question anymore.
I'd been downplaying my success for so long that they had no idea I'd become one of the highest earning content creators in the true crime space. I took a deep breath and said, I'm currently averaging about $800,000 a month. The silence that followed was deafening. Miguel literally choked on his beer. Sarah's mouth fell open. My dad dropped his paper plate, and my mom stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. 800,000 a month? Miguel asked, like he was trying to make sure he'd heard correctly. When I nodded, the room erupted. Everyone started talking at once, asking how that was possible, whether I was serious, and what exactly I was doing that could generate that kind of income. I spent the next hour explaining the accountability project, the corporate partnerships, the revenue streams from multiple platforms, and the consulting contracts with law enforcement agencies. My dad kept shaking his head and saying, I can't believe it. My daughter makes more in a month than I made in 20 years. My mom was crying, partly from pride and partly from guilt about the years she'd spent worrying about my hobby. But the most meaningful reaction came from Miguel. He pulled me aside later that evening and apologized for all the times he'd called my work embarrassing or unrealistic. He said he'd been wrong about everything and that he was amazed by what I'd accomplished. Jess, I thought you were wasting your life making videos about dead people, he said. I had no idea you were building something this incredible. I'm sorry I wasn't supportive when you needed it.
The family dynamics shifted completely after that conversation. Suddenly, I wasn't the family member they worried about. I was the one they came to for advice. My parents started bragging to their friends about their daughter, the famous investigative journalist. Miguel began sharing my videos on his social media and telling anyone who would listen about his sister's success. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Detective Morrison, who had helped me with my very first case, called to tell me that the FBI had created a new division specifically focused on corporate accountability investigations, and they wanted to offer me a formal consulting role with the federal government. The FBI contract was worth $2 million over 3 years, but more importantly, it represented official recognition that the work I'd been doing was valuable enough for the nation's premier law enforcement agency to want my expertise. When I told my family about the FBI contract, my mom broke down crying again. She said she was proud of me for never giving up on what I believed in, even when everyone around me thought I was making a mistake. My dad's response was simpler, but equally meaningful. I guess you knew what you were doing after all. Looking back, the most incredible thing wasn't the money or the recognition. It was the realization that the same family members who had once been embarrassed by my YouTube channel were now telling everyone they knew about my success. The work they dismissed as a weird hobby was now something they bragged about to their friends and colleagues. But even with all the financial success and family approval, I knew the most important part of my work wasn't the money I was making. It was the fact that families were getting answers, criminals were being held accountable, and systems of corruption were being exposed and dismantled. The $800,000 a month was life-changing, but the knowledge that my work was actually making a difference in the world was priceless. The months following my family's discovery of my true income brought unexpected challenges I hadn't anticipated. Success at this level comes with complications that no one prepares you for, and suddenly having generational wealth changes relationships in ways that aren't always positive. My cousin Rebecca, whose wedding had been the scene of my aunt's mockery 2 years earlier, called me in June 2024 asking for a loan to start her own business. When I asked what kind of business, she vaguely mentioned influencer marketing and said she needed $200,000 to get started. The same woman who had laughed at my YouTube channel was now asking me to fund her attempt to become an influencer. This became a pattern. Extended family members who had dismissed my work were suddenly reaching out with business proposals, investment opportunities, and requests for financial help. My Uncle Pete, who had mocked my $8,000 quarterly earnings, asked if I wanted to invest in his construction company's expansion. When I politely declined, he accused me of being too good for the family now. The most difficult situation involved my parents. They were incredibly proud of my success, but they also felt guilty about not supporting me initially.
My mom started overcompensating, bragging about my achievements to anyone who would listen, and sharing my videos constantly on Facebook. While I appreciated her enthusiasm, it sometimes felt like she was trying to make up for years of skepticism all at once. My dad's response was different but equally challenging. He became obsessed with understanding my business, asking detailed questions about revenue streams, expenses, and long-term financial planning. He meant well, but it felt like he was trying to manage my career retroactively, offering advice about decisions I'd already made successfully. The real test of my new circumstances came when I decided to expand the accountability project internationally. My anonymous client, who I'd finally learned was technology entrepreneur David Chen, wanted to launch similar investigative operations in Europe and Asia. The goal was to create a global network of independent journalists who could tackle corruption cases that transcended national boundaries. My role would be to oversee the entire operation, training other investigators in my techniques, and coordinating international cases that required multiple teams working across different countries. The compensation structure for this expanded role was even more staggering: a base salary of $500,000 annually, plus equity stakes in the media companies we'd be launching, plus performance bonuses that could reach into the millions. But the most exciting part wasn't the money, it was the scope of what we'd be able to accomplish. We were planning to investigate arms dealers who supplied weapons to terrorist organizations, pharmaceutical companies that tested dangerous drugs on populations in developing countries, and technology firms that sold surveillance equipment to authoritarian governments. These weren't cold cases about individual disappearances anymore. These were investigations that could expose networks of corruption affecting millions of people worldwide. The work would be dangerous, legally complex, and politically sensitive in ways that my previous cases had never been. The first international investigation I led focused on a network of shell companies that were being used to launder money for human trafficking operations across Southeast Asia. Working with investigators in Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, we spent 8 months documenting how legitimate businesses were being used as fronts for operations that enslaved thousands of people. The investigation required me to travel to 6 different countries, interview victims who were risking their lives to speak with us, and navigate legal systems that were often corrupt themselves. It was the most challenging and important work I'd ever done, and it resulted in arrests across 3 countries and the rescue of over 200 trafficking victims. The documentary series we produced about this investigation won a Peabody Award and was nominated for an Emmy. More importantly, it led to international policy changes that made it harder for these criminal networks to operate. Suddenly, I wasn't just a successful YouTuber or even a successful investigative journalist. I was someone whose work was influencing global policy. By the end of 2024, my monthly income had stabilized at just over $1 million when including all revenue streams. The Accountability Project had grown into a multimedia empire with partnerships at Netflix, HBO, major news networks, and streaming platforms around the world. My YouTube channel had 3.5 million subscribers, and my investigations were being translated into dozens of languages. But the moment that truly crystallized how much my life had changed came during Thanksgiving 2024. The same family gathering where my aunt had mocked my bedroom videos 2.5 years earlier was now a celebration of my achievements. My extended family wanted to hear about my international work, my awards, and my upcoming projects. My Aunt Sarah, who had been the most dismissive of my early work, pulled me aside to apologize. She said she'd been watching all my recent investigations and was amazed by the impact I was having on the world. She also admitted that she'd been wrong to judge my work based on her limited understanding of what YouTubers did. "Jessica, I thought you were just another person making silly videos for the internet," she said. "I had no idea you were building something that would change how investigative journalism works. I'm sorry I wasn't supportive when you needed it." But the most meaningful moment came when my nephew Carlos, Miguel's 8-year-old son, told his class that his aunt was his hero because she catches bad guys and helps people who are lost. His teacher had asked the students to talk about their role models, and he'd chosen me over professional athletes, movie stars, and superheroes. When Miguel told me about Carlos's presentation, he started crying. He said he'd never been prouder to be my brother and that he hoped Carlos would grow up to be as brave and determined as his aunt.
Coming from someone who had spent years telling me to get a real job, it was the ultimate vindication. The financial success was extraordinary, but what mattered most was knowing that I'd built something meaningful. The families who had gotten closure about their missing loved ones, the victims who had been rescued from trafficking networks, the corrupt officials who had been exposed and prosecuted, that was the real measure of my success. Looking back, the journey from making videos in my childhood bedroom to earning over $1 million a month seems almost impossible. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was proving to myself and my family that following your passion, even when everyone thinks you're crazy, can lead to outcomes that nobody imagined possible. My family learned that success doesn't always look like what they expected. Sometimes it starts with something that seems embarrassing or unrealistic, but with enough dedication and skill, it can become something that changes the world. The $800,000 monthly checks that initially shocked my family became just one part of a much larger story about the importance of supporting people's dreams, even when you don't understand them. My work had evolved far beyond anything I'd originally envisioned, but it all started with that first shaky video about Maria Gonzalez in my bedroom. Today, when young people ask me for advice about pursuing unconventional careers, I tell them what I wish someone had told me. The people who love you might not understand your vision initially, but if you're truly creating value and making a difference, they'll eventually see what you saw all along. Sometimes the thing that embarrasses your family becomes the thing they're most proud of. You just have to be brave enough to keep going when everyone thinks you're making a mistake. That's the real lesson from this entire experience. Not that YouTube can make you rich or that family approval doesn't matter, but that authentic work that helps people will eventually be recognized for what it is, no matter how unconventional it seems at the beginning. The monthly checks were just proof of value I was already creating. The real success was knowing that my work mattered enough for people to pay me generously to keep doing it. Early 2025 brought a phone call that would redefine everything I thought I knew about the impact of my work. It wasn't from a client, a network executive, or even another investigator. It was from Maria Gonzalez's mother, Rosa, the woman whose daughter's 1994 disappearance had launched my entire career 3 years earlier. Rosa was calling to tell me that the Tucson Police Department had made an arrest in Maria's case. After 31 years of silence, they had finally charged a man named Robert Hayes with her murder. The evidence that led to his arrest came directly from the investigation I had conducted, the witnesses I had interviewed, and the connections I had uncovered that the original investigators had missed. But Rosa wasn't calling just to share the news of the arrest. She was calling to tell me something that made me understand the true value of what I'd built. Maria's case had inspired other families to come forward with information about their own missing loved ones. The publicity from my videos had created a network of families who were sharing resources, supporting each other, and refusing to let their cases be forgotten. They had formed what they called the Martinez Network, named after my investigation business, and it had grown to include over 300 families across the southwestern United States. These weren't wealthy clients who could afford private investigators. These were working-class families who had been ignored by overwhelmed police departments and forgotten by the media. Rosa told me that families in the Martinez Network were using the techniques I had demonstrated in my videos to conduct their own investigations. They were sharing research methods, pooling resources to hire experts when needed, and creating their own support system for the long, painful process of seeking answers about their missing family members. What struck me most was that this network had formed organically, without any involvement from me or my team. These families had taken the work I was doing and adapted it to their own circumstances, proving that the real value of my investigations wasn't just the individual cases I solved, but the framework I had created that others could use to seek their own answers. This realization led to the next evolution of my work. Instead of just investigating cases for wealthy clients or major media productions, I decided to create a foundation that would provide resources and training to families who couldn't afford professional investigators. The Martinez Foundation for Missing Persons would offer free investigative services to qualifying families, train volunteers in research techniques, and provide legal support for families navigating the complexities of cold case investigations.
David Chen was immediately supportive of the foundation concept and offered to provide the initial funding. But I realized that relying on a single benefactor, even one as generous as David, wasn't sustainable for something this important. I needed to create multiple revenue streams that could support the foundation's work indefinitely. The solution came from an unexpected source: licensing my investigative techniques to law enforcement agencies around the world. Police departments were struggling with massive backlogs of cold cases, and many of them lacked the resources or expertise to conduct the kind of comprehensive investigations I had been doing.
By spring 2025, I had developed a training program that taught detectives and investigators my research methodologies, evidence analysis techniques, and interview strategies. The program was generating over $200,000 per month in licensing fees, all of which went directly into funding the foundation's work. But the most rewarding aspect of this expansion wasn't the additional income. It was seeing professional investigators achieve breakthroughs in cases that had been cold for years or even decades. Departments in Chicago, Atlanta, and Sacramento were reporting significant progress on previously unsolvable cases after implementing my techniques. The success of the law enforcement training program led to something I had never expected. Universities began reaching out to develop academic courses based on my work. By June 2025, I was teaching a graduate-level course in advanced cold case investigation at Arizona State University, and similar programs were being launched at schools in California, Texas, and New York. Teaching forced me to articulate and systematize knowledge that I had developed intuitively over years of practice. Breaking down my investigation process into teachable components helped me understand my own methods better and identify areas where I could improve my techniques. The students in these programs weren't just criminal justice majors. They included journalism students, psychology majors, and even computer science students who were interested in using technology to solve cold cases. The interdisciplinary nature of the classes led to innovations and approaches that I wouldn't have discovered working alone. One of my students, a computer science major named Alex Rivera, developed an algorithm that could analyze patterns in missing person cases and identify potential connections between seemingly unrelated disappearances. His work led to the discovery of a serial killer who had been operating across multiple states for over a decade. Another student, journalism major Sophia Chen, no relation to David, used data visualization techniques to map the geographic and temporal patterns of unsolved cases in Phoenix. Her analysis revealed that several disappearances that police had considered isolated incidents were actually connected to a human trafficking operation that had been operating undetected for years. These breakthroughs reinforced my belief that the most important contribution I could make wasn't solving individual cases, but creating systems and training programs that would enable hundreds of other people to solve thousands of cases over the coming decades. By the end of 2025, the Martinez Foundation was handling over 50 active investigations simultaneously. The law enforcement training program was being used by departments in 12 countries, and the university courses were being taught at 47 schools worldwide. My personal income had grown to nearly $1.5 million monthly, but more importantly, the network of people using my techniques was solving cases at a rate that no single investigator could ever achieve. The financial success had become almost secondary to the systemic change we were creating. When I looked at the monthly revenue reports, I didn't see dollar amounts. I saw the number of families who would receive answers, the number of criminals who would be held accountable, and the number of future investigators who would be trained to continue this work. The most powerful validation of this approach came when the FBI announced that cold case clearance rates in departments using my training program had increased by an average of 43%. These weren't just statistics. They represented hundreds of families who had received closure and hundreds of dangerous individuals who had been removed from society. My family's transformation during this period was as dramatic as my professional evolution. Miguel had become my unofficial business manager, helping coordinate speaking engagements and manage the administrative side of the foundation. My parents had become ambassadors for the work, speaking at conferences about the importance of supporting unconventional career paths. But the most meaningful change was in how we related to each other. The financial success had initially created some awkwardness and tension, but working together on the foundation had restored the closeness we'd had when I was younger.
My family wasn't just proud of what I had accomplished, they were active participants in helping me accomplish it. During Christmas 2025, as we sat around the same table where they had once worried about my embarrassing YouTube channel, my dad raised a toast to the Martinez Foundation's first year of operations. He said he was proud not just of my financial success, but of how he had used that success to create something that would help people for generations to come. My mom added that she had learned never to doubt someone's dreams, no matter how unusual they might seem. She said watching my journey had taught her that the most important thing parents can do is support their children's passions, even when they don't understand them. As I looked around that table, I realized that the true measure of success wasn't the monthly checks that had initially shocked my family into silence. It was the fact that we had all grown from the experience, that the work I was doing was making a genuine difference in the world, and that I had found a way to turn my passion into something that would outlast my own career. The embarrassing YouTube channel that had once caused family arguments was now the foundation of a global movement that was changing how society approaches unsolved cases and missing persons. The monthly income that had seemed impossibly large just a year earlier was now simply the fuel that powered much more important work. That's perhaps the most important lesson from this entire journey. Success isn't just about proving people wrong or achieving financial independence. True success is about using whatever platform and resources you build to create positive change that extends far beyond your own life. March 2026 brought a revelation that changed everything I thought about my journey. I was preparing for a keynote speech at the International Conference on Criminal Justice when I received an encrypted message from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line simply read, "The real story behind your success."
The message contained detailed financial records, communication logs, and internal documents that revealed something I had never suspected. David Chen, my anonymous benefactor who had funded the Accountability Project, wasn't just a wealthy tech entrepreneur with a passion for justice. He was a former pharmaceutical executive whose brother had been murdered by corporate assassins after trying to expose safety violations at their company. David had been systematically using my investigations to build cases against the same networks that had killed his brother. Every case he had assigned me, every resource he had provided, every connection he had facilitated was part of an elaborate plan to expose and destroy the corruption networks that operated at the highest levels of corporate America. But here's what shocked me most. David had been terminally ill with cancer for the past 2 years. The doctors had given him 18 months to live back in early 2024, and he had been using his remaining time to ensure that his brother's killers, and hundreds of others like them, would finally face justice. The encrypted message was David's final communication. He was entering hospice care and wanted me to know the complete truth about our partnership before he died. More importantly, he was transferring full ownership of the Accountability Project to me, along with an endowment worth $57 million to ensure the work could continue indefinitely. I flew to San Francisco immediately to meet with David one last time. He was staying at a private medical facility overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and despite his condition, his mind was as sharp as ever. We spent 6 hours going through documents that revealed the true scope of what we had accomplished together. The investigations I had conducted over the past 3 years had resulted in the arrests of over 200 individuals involved in corporate corruption, human trafficking, and organized crime. The documentary series and news reports based on my work had led to policy changes in 14 countries and had inspired similar investigative initiatives on every continent. But David's most important revelation was about the broader impact of my work. The techniques I had developed for investigating cold cases were being used by human rights organizations to document war crimes, by environmental groups to expose corporate pollution, and by anti-corruption activists to hold government officials accountable. My embarrassing YouTube channel had accidentally created a new model for independent investigative journalism that was being replicated around the world. Journalists in countries with restricted press freedom were using my methods to investigate stories their mainstream media couldn't touch. Activists in developing nations were adapting my research techniques to expose local corruption networks. David passed away on April 15, 2026, but not before ensuring that the Accountability Project would continue indefinitely.
His final gift wasn't just the financial endowment, it was a detailed strategic plan for expanding the project's work into areas I had never considered, including corporate espionage, political corruption, and international arms dealing. The months following David's death were the most challenging of my entire career. Suddenly, I wasn't just a successful investigative journalist. I was the custodian of a $57 million foundation with operations on 6 continents and responsibilities that extended far beyond solving individual cases. But the real test of everything I had built came in July 2026, when my work attracted the attention of people who didn't want to be investigated. I started receiving threats from lawyers representing multinational corporations, warnings from private security firms, and pressure from government officials who wanted certain investigations to stop. The intimidation campaign escalated when my parents' house was broken into and my research files were stolen from my office. Nothing else was taken, making it clear that someone was trying to interfere with specific investigations. For the first time since starting this work, I felt genuinely afraid for my safety and the safety of my family. But instead of backing down, I decided to investigate the intimidation campaign itself. Using the same techniques I had applied to cold cases, I began documenting the threats, tracing the sources of pressure, and building a comprehensive case against the networks that were trying to silence me. What I discovered was that my work had become so effective at exposing high-level corruption that a consortium of corporations and government agencies had formed specifically to neutralize investigative journalists like me. They had been monitoring my activities for over a year and had developed detailed plans for discrediting my work and destroying my reputation. The investigation into my own intimidation became the most important case I had ever worked on. It revealed a global network of entities that specialized in silencing whistleblowers, intimidating journalists, and protecting powerful individuals from accountability. The evidence I gathered implicated officials in 6 governments and executives from dozens of multinational corporations. When I published the findings of this investigation in September 2026, the response was immediate and dramatic. 3 government ministers resigned within a week, major corporations fired entire executive teams, and law enforcement agencies in multiple countries launched investigations based on my evidence. But the most meaningful response came from my family. When the threats against me escalated and I had to hire professional security, my parents didn't ask me to stop my work or consider moving to a safer career. Instead, they asked how they could help protect the foundation's work and ensure that it would continue even if something happened to me. Miguel took a leave of absence to help coordinate security for the foundation's operations. My mom started working full-time as the foundation's victim services coordinator, using her natural empathy and communication skills to support families who were going through investigations. My dad became the foundation's volunteer coordinator, organizing the thousands of people who had offered to help with research and administrative work. The family that had once been embarrassed by my YouTube channel was now fully committed to protecting and expanding the work that had grown from it. They understood that what we were doing was bigger than any individual career or financial success. We were part of a global movement to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. By the end of 2026, my monthly income had stabilized at around $2 million, but the number had lost most of its significance. The money was simply a tool that enabled much more important work, and I had learned to measure success in terms of cases solved, criminals prosecuted, and systems changed rather than dollars earned. As I sit here in early 2027, reflecting on the journey from that first shaky video about Maria Gonzalez to running a global anti-corruption foundation, I'm amazed by how completely my life and my family's perspective have been transformed. The same relatives who once laughed at my embarrassing hobby now introduce me as their famous investigative journalist, daughter, sister, and niece. The work they dismissed as unrealistic has become their primary source of pride and purpose. The financial success they doubted was possible has become the foundation for work that will continue for generations. But perhaps the most important transformation has been in my relationship with my family. We went from a dynamic where they were worried about my future to one where we're all working together toward a shared mission that's bigger than any of us individually. The monthly checks that initially shocked them into silence have become just one part of a much larger story about the importance of believing in people's dreams, even when those dreams seem impossible or embarrassing. My family learned that success can take forms they never imagined, and I learned that having their support made even the most challenging aspects of this work manageable. When people ask me what advice I would give to someone whose family doesn't support their unconventional career goals, I tell them this: keep doing the work that matters to you, focus on creating real value for others, and trust that the people who love you will eventually see what you've been trying to build. Sometimes, the thing your family finds most embarrassing about you becomes the thing they're most proud of. You just have to be brave enough to pursue your vision long enough for them to understand it. The embarrassing YouTube channel that started in my childhood bedroom has become a global force for justice. The monthly income that once seemed impossibly large has become the fuel for work that will outlast all of us. And the family that once worried about my future has become my strongest support system in building something that will change the world. That's the real lesson from this entire experience. Authentic work that helps people will eventually be recognized and supported, no matter how unconventional it seems at the beginning. You just have to persist long enough for the value to become undeniable. The journey from embarrassment to $800,000 a month was really just the beginning. The real story is what happens when you use that success to create something that matters more than the money itself. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.